What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone, and I'm your host, Garrison Roy. But on this episode, we're going to have a full-length interview. If you're new here, you can go in and check out some of the rants where I just kind of go on tangents about hot topics in the industry or just calling people out on their BS. And then also deep dive educational explorations to help people understand more intricacies of skill acquisition and being in the zone, right? And then also mental minutes to help with mental game hacks to elevate your overall performance. But if you have any other future topics or guests or questions, you can submit that to inthezonepodcast123@gmail.com. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right on into this one because I think it's going to be a great episode. But we have Dr. Emily Ferree with Ferree.pt.lab. What's going on?
Hi, thanks so much for having me this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we connected over the bridge seminar, which I thought was awesome. And you opened it up Saturday morning, and me and Rob Blanc, my business partner, we were just kind of blown away. We're like, wow, that's the best biomechanist we've ever heard. Because, and we talked about this a little bit off air, but how, we want to use biomechanics, but a lot of people seem to have it misinterpreted, or they don't know how to apply what um, the the numbers and things like that to actual real life application. So if you want to
Yeah,
touch on that a little bit.
yeah, for sure. I think that's been the biggest thing I've learned being in this industry. So I've been studying pitching biomechanics in the lab for 7 years now. And the biggest thing I've realized is that there's this huge disconnect between sports science departments and the player performance side. So a lot of times player performance, they're looking at videos of their players and they can qualitatively assess a player really well. And then on the biomechanist side or the sports science side, they're pumping out just numbers on numbers on numbers that out of context just don't mean a lot and become really hard to make decisions based off of and become really hard to integrate into any sort of player development plan. And so I think I've always tried to take the approach of finding things in the biomechanics reports and finding things in the numbers that you can actually apply to player development and can actually tell you a story versus just supplying people with just a gridlock of numbers that really don't mean anything. And the other thing, and you and I touched on this a little bit, but the other thing I feel like is really important to me from the biomechanics side is that the data should always tell the story of what your eyes see. And so
Mhm.
when I have students in the lab and when I'm teaching other physical therapists, I always tell them that they're not even allowed to look at the data until they can tell me what's going on with a pitch qualitatively. So they have to be able to look at the video and see from a qualitative perspective what's going on with the pitcher, see areas where they're inefficient, see areas where they're losing connectivity, see areas where they're not rotating well, and then look at the data to figure out why. Because I think if we do it in the opposite direction and from a biomechanist standpoint, just start to look at the troves of data that you get from a report, it becomes really hard to pick out what's actually important, what's actually telling the story. And then a lot of times we just end up reporting on measures. And I talked about this in my talk, but we end up reporting on measures and then trying to take action on measures that are results and not actually what's causing those results. So, and in that case, biomechanics ends up becoming really useless, which is the huge heartbreak, right? Like we have all this data and all these tools, like it should be so useful to us. And I think that's a big reason why it stops being useful.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I think it was actually one portion of your presentation where you were talking about how the arm flip up was actually more influenced on, just how the pelvis was rotating and the overall stride length. And, for them to take into context of the whole versus just isolating it, just the arm action, which I currently, if I see someone do that on just the performance side, it bugs the crap out of me too. So
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like, there's so much more to that than just that one isolated piece, right? And that's
Yeah.
kind of goes into, and I harp on this a lot in other previous episodes of more of a reductionist approach versus a holistic approach, or
For sure.
in a way like ecological, if that even makes sense. So
Yeah, 1,000%. I always say like the best and worst thing we ever did in baseball was create that, and I'm sure everyone's seen it. We create that little montage of like a picture and at like a still point at each phase. And that's like how people learned how to analyze a pitch is they took a continuous dynamic movement and then we just stopped it at still frames in time. And then we said, at this point in time, at this point in time, at this point in time, did your pitcher get to X, Y, and Z positions? And so we made a dynamic movement into a series of static postures and then tried to evaluate and make decisions based off that, and then tried to train based off that. And we try to train people into certain postures at certain points in time. And that's just not the way the body moves. That's not the way skill acquisition works.
Not
And
how humans move in general. Yeah.
yeah, I think we mess a lot of guys up that way. And then I think we end up reporting on data points that are really meaningless that way. And, for example, like the example with, the arm flipping up out of time, or not enough, or whatever it is not an isolated event, right? Like it's a part attached to a whole that's all moving continuously together. And so if you try and isolate something like that out, you're just going to miss the point. And I think a lot of times we're reporting on, one of the biggest points in time that people report on and then try and intervene for is stride foot contact and what position the pitcher is in at stride foot contact. That is the middle of a ballistic, violent, just continuous movement. And if you try and get a pitcher to do something cognitively with intent at that point in time, you're going to throw them off in so many ways. Like that is not the point of time for any sort of cognitive intent. Like the ball has rolled down the hill. And if you're trying to veer directions at that point, you're just going to mess somebody up.
Oh, sure. Well, and if they are going to make any adjustments, those are they're not conscious adjustments. They're kind of more like the ways that they're just going to organize themselves, figure out how to throw it over the white thing.
Yeah.
60 feet, 6 inches away.
1,000%.
They're just trying to accomplish that goal is like, hey,
yes.
throw it over this.
So. Yeah. The best thing we can do as, physical therapists, biomechanists, pitching performance people is you just set up the environment for them to get where they need to go, right? Like we essentially should be setting up like the bumpers in a bowling alley, right? To make sure that ball can go down the lane and not hit the gutters. And people try and like reinvent the bowling alley itself. It's like just set them up so that they can get where they need to go, set them up to push off the mound in the direction that they need to go, give them a stride length parameter that makes sense for their body. Like, certain things that we can intervene at that aren't going to require a lot of cognitive intent in the middle of the movement, but that basically give them the parameters to move in the direction their body wants to, needs to, and is designed to. Which I think the other big mistake we make is we try and look at what we think are, proper mechanics and proper numbers, and we try and fit them on everybody instead of looking at a body and saying what mechanics fit for you.
Oh man, love that. Well, that's a whole nother part that I think we'll get down to in a little bit is how physiology does kind of determine how they're going to move. And you can have that, one size fits all approach for everybody's lower half has to look this way, or everybody's arm action has to move the same way. You see some guys like they can't posteriorly tilt, but they're like really electric, like super far down. So they don't necessarily like they still need some, but it doesn't need to be like crazy amount where they get in crazy positions because they're kind of more somehow gravitated towards more of that, lower 3/4 kind of like Tyler Rogers type delivery, right? Where it's just like super, super low. And a good example of that I've met and seen in person was Steve Cishek. He's obviously retired now. But before when he was in college at Carson Newman, and he was telling me this, he was pretty straight over the top. And then over time, as he's continued to throw, his body just kind of naturally made an adjustment to make him, a lower slot. Yeah. Which I think is kind of interesting too, because like if you had another coach looking at him, he was like, hey, your slot's dropping, but that inevitably helped him pitch in the big leagues for 10 plus years. So
yeah. Somebody recently asked me, like, over the course of a season, a lot of times we'll see a guy's slot drop. What do you think the reason for that is? And I said, well, first off, when it comes to slot, I don't think there's any point in having any sort of conversation except around, does it match the planar rotation of their torso? Because that's the only thing that I care about. So they could be way over the top. They could be a submariner. They could be a low 3/4. I don't care as long as it matches the planar rotation of their torso. And so then when you have this conversation about guys slot dropping over the course of a season, my question is, are they dropping out of plane of rotation? Then it's an issue. Are they dropping into plane of rotation? Then it's probably because their arm is tired.
Yeah, their body's adapting. Sure.
And their arm wants to be efficient. It wants to work less hard. So it's going to drop into the plane of rotation of its torso so it can capture more energy. And you don't have to create as much internal torque with your musculature, and you can just allow the transfer of angular momentum from your torso to your arm do what it needs to do. Your arm moves just as fast without all of that torque coming from your musculature, because your arm doesn't have to work to generate momentum. It's just being transferred momentum. So a lot of times these changes, I think, that we see over the course of a season, we forget the body is a self-organizing organism, and it's smart, and your body naturally wants to be efficient. So, the same reason, like when you're on a long run, like your body's going to settle into a rhythm that it feels like it can sustain. Same thing, like if you look at the course of a season, like that's a long run, that's a marathon. Your body's going to settle into a rhythm that it can sustain. And
Yeah,
again, the only
you're
caveat to
not
that
gonna
is if the
you're
arm's
not gonna
drifting out
push
of
it.
plane. But
Exactly. Oh, for sure. And for those of y'all who are listening and not really watching, it's kind of, if you drew a straight line or you had a PVC, even with your shoulders, wherever that torso is tilted is kind of where that arm slat should be coming out of. It's kind of what she's referring to for that.
exactly.
One, I guess, question for you on that, because obviously you being a physical therapist, you also are very in tune with the physiology side of things. If, let's say, a guy does have a slot that's outside and it's a little bit lower, one of
Yep.
my first initial thoughts is like, okay, hey, like what's tacking it down? But obviously, like I mentioned this earlier, if they don't have posterior tilt, if they don't have T-spine extension, clavicular rotation, right? Like all those are probably points to check off. But
Yep.
if all those are checked, is there anything else that you would go to other than like just completely changing the arm slot? Would there be any other physical boxes that you would look at?
From a movement standpoint, one of the first things I always look at is how did they create momentum off that back leg? How did they push? If
Yeah.
they're not rotating well, you'd be surprised how often just teaching them to rotate out of the back leg will clean up a lot of arm slot issues, even a lot of timing issues. So that's the first thing I look at. The next thing I look at, if that doesn't clean it up, or if they are rotating well out of their back leg, I'm looking at pelvis and torso posture. So how much pelvis and torso lateral tilt are you getting? How much anterior posterior tilt are you getting? So a lot of times that will set the arm and shoulder up to be in a particular position. Again, because your shoulder, a lot of the times, it wants to be in what we call an open pack position. So depending on the angle of your torso, sometimes your humerus will follow, just to be in a position that creates the most space in that joint, because it's about to rotate at, anywhere between 7 and 10,000 degrees per second. So if it's in a position that's very closed off, your body doesn't want to be in that position. So I'll look at the posture of the torso to see if there's something we can clean up there. And then the last thing that I generally look at is how they took the ball away. So a lot of times the way that they take the ball away sets up a path for the arm that's hard to get out of if it is going to be really out of plane. So I try and follow the philosophy of as little as possible, as much as necessary when making changes for pitchers. So instead of saying, I don't like the position of your arm, so we're going to change these 4 different things, I'll try and hit the lowest hanging fruit first. Okay, let me just get you to rotate better on your back leg. Did that clean it up? Great. I'm not changing anything else. Even if I don't like the way you took the ball out of your glove, even if I think that's funky, even if I'm going to make one change. If that got me where I needed to be, I'm going to leave it. And I think, for a lot of times people just try and do too much with a pitcher. So I try and hit the lowest hanging fruit first, and then only add on to that if I'm not getting where I need to go.
Oh, sure. I would say even kind of like, are they capturing any momentum from that handbrake? That makes sense versus just kind of actively pulling it back. That's one thing I can't really stand with like some of these forced short arm actions. If that
Right.
makes any sense, right? Like it's just too muscled up. It's too stiff. There's
Yeah.
no fluidity to that movement. Um, and I've always had this theory too, and that whether it's right or wrong, I don't really know, but I just say it's like, hey, you're really hand driven versus like, more center of your mass scap, or some guys might even venture to the elbow, which is fine. But if they just think straight back here and all they're thinking from handbrake is the movement of where their hand goes, that can also, in my opinion, kind of cut out a lot of those fluid movements within the arm action too. If
Yeah. 1,000%.
they're coached to move that way.
Yeah. That's a lot of times I think I see that a lot when guys are coached to get to a certain position. Again, we took this beautifully fluid movement and we made a bunch of static postures, and we say, hey, you got to get to here. And then guys are just muscling the arm up, which does a lot of things from a physiology standpoint. You have certain muscles on that really shouldn't be if we're trying to transfer energy. So the arm is really stiff. A stiff arm is not as easy to transfer angular momentum up into. But from a timing issue too, it ends up messing up guys timing wise, because they're getting their arm to a position they shouldn't be in yet.
Yeah. No, yeah, 100% agree with that. And I may be a little on the I guess aggressive side of this for my personal assessments for athletes I work with. I typically don't even do like a full-on assessment like I used to do probably 3 years ago, where it was just running through every single checkpoint and static stuff to be able to see what range they had. But now I start actually with pitching video or some type of throwing video that was recent. And then from there, that's when if I need to go look at something else, is kind of where I would go to. But kind of curious on what your starting process is. Do you have them all kind of go through the biomechanics lab, or do you have them, you know, just do some other dynamic athletic movements, or do you any static assessments at all?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think people are always looking for how do you assess a pitcher outside of the video? And my answer is always grossly disappointing for everybody. And I say I don't assess pitchers outside of throwing video.
Wow.
Um, to me, and what I've learned over the years is there is not a static assessment I have done that has ever correlated to pitching performance or even the type of movements that they're in pitching. So, as physical therapists, we have been trained to do this. I went to the #1 physical therapy school in the country. So I'm very confident
Which was
that
where, by the way?
what?
Which was where, by the way?
Which is USC.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so when I graduated from there, they were the #1 physical therapy school in the country. So I am very confident that my physical therapy education was excellent. But I'll tell you that what we're trained to do is throw athletes on a table and then, take their arm up into 90 degrees of abduction, test external rotation, test internal rotation, throw them on the table, bring their hip up passively into 90 degrees of flexion, and then test internal, external, and none of these postures are the actual positions that a pitcher is in when they're going down the mound. And there's so much that changes with range of motion when you add, eccentric load, when you add fascial stretch across an entire system, when your arm's in this position, but your back hip is in this position. And then when you add speed of movement too. So, and the research would tell you as well that all of these static, especially range of motion tests that we do not correlate with injury, and they do not correlate with ball velocity. So they're not a great performance metric, but they're not a great assessment of injury risk either. So, and the example I gave in my presentation is when we look at layback, it's hugely influenced by how fast your torso is rotating and hugely influenced on the position of your humerus in relation to the joint line of your two shoulders. So again, unless you're assessing shoulder external rotation under a torso rotation of 5,000 degrees a second, I don't know how much that correlates to what you're seeing in pitching video. So I don't see a lot of use in it. The only time I ever take out a goniometer is if I am rehabbing an athlete that is post-surgical and has actual, very measurable, significant range of motion deficits because they're post-surgical. But I'm generally not taking static range of motion measurements. And people feel really disappointed in that often. And so my process looks like pitchers come through, we measure them in the lab, we look at their video, based on their video, then we look at their data and the numbers. And if there's something hugely off, we'll take them through, put them, if I'm really thinking okay, for example, let's say somebody flies open really early. My first question is, do they have the actual range of motion to be in the position they're in? But instead of throwing them on a table and measuring their hip range of motion, I just ask them to shorten their stride. Okay, if you shorten your stride and now you can hold off your pelvis and torso way better, that tells me you didn't have the range of motion to be in the stride length that you were in. I don't need to put you on the table to measure your hip range of motion. I need to play with some factors and see what the consequence or result is. Because again, the range of motion I may measure on the table may not tell me the story. He may look like he has great hip range of motion on the table, but in his pitch, he's running out of room. He's running out of slack. Things are getting pulled open. He's now rotating together. And it may be he just doesn't have a lot of control at that end range of motion. It may not be a passive range of motion issue that I can identify as on a table. So I'd much rather look at the video, make an assessment, and then start to make changes based on what I think might be wrong, versus trying to find some sort of passive assessment that's going to explain it, because and maybe somebody else has better passive measurements, but I've never found one that makes sense to me.
Yeah, well, and typically, and again, I'm guilty of this too. So for those of you who are listening, if this hits home, I used to do this. I would do
Yeah.
the passive assessment and then I would give them, you know, stretching exercises or things like that, which, may or may not have helped. But again, they're not anything close to the actual movement or the skill of pitching. So you're removing so much context of not only the speed of everything, but, you know, them standing up. You're trying to do stuff on the floor, on the ground, which, there's people need that for certain things, but I think if you're removing too much of that, it's not really helping, and quite frankly, might be a little bit more of a waste of your time than I would think.
Yeah.
Um, but there was one guy, ex-pro, and I've never heard this before from anyone, but he kind of said it to where as he's letting guys ramp back up, he would take whatever their normal stride length was and then change and shorten it based on their percentage of their throwing intensity. So if they're throwing like 50%, they're only allowed to stride 50%, or so on and so forth. I've actually never heard that before. I was like, it's worth a shot. And maybe even then, with them shorting it from that amount to then gradually going out, they might find a optimal stride length that's more applicable to what they should move like, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of almost using differential learning within the stride length itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And like he didn't really know any of those technical terms, but I was like, wow, that makes sense without really having any science behind it, to be honest, right? Because
Yeah.
some people say, I think it was about 10 years ago, everybody was like, oh, you need to have the exact amount of stride as your height. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
well, what about guys who have really poor adductors? Are they supposed to
Mhm.
stride out 100%? Like, you don't really
What
know.
about guys
Right?
who have retroverted hips?
That's true.
Just the structure of their pelvis is not going to allow them to do that. Like, yeah, we just totally discount individual physiologic differences when we say stuff like that.
Yeah, it's speaking in absolutes versus allowing guys to have a more authentic delivery to what their body's capable of doing.
Yep,
So,
thousand
well,
percent.
yeah, I think whenever you're looking at the lower half though, like, is there any of those, and I hate to say checkpoints because everybody thinks of a checkpoint as those still frames that we
Yeah.
were talking about, right? Is there any dynamic points within the delivery, right? You talked about momentum, but is there any portion, and I'll just kind of say this, like for me, I look at kind of more of when they're starting their forward move, are they able to have, a stable pelvis, the knee and the femur, basically like is the femur staying steady and then exploding? Is that something that you would look at, or have you seen guys who maybe just kind of move all over the place and still somehow figure out to get in a good position?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to assess is what somebody looks like at knee lift. If
Hmm.
they're really unstable at knee lift, or if they knee lift and then they have a center of gravity shift in order to balance, things are about to fall apart. So being able to control knee lift and have your center of gravity right in the middle of your foot when you go is one of the biggest indicators that somebody's going to rotate well out of their foot. And the reason for that is if your weight's all the way in your toe, you're going to shift your center of gravity so that torque ends up happening mostly at the knee. So you're going to be, I'm sure we've all heard this term a ton, like a very quad dominant push. Your quad is not a rotational muscle. So the more torque that we put through the quad, the more somebody's just going to extend out of their back leg. In the same way that if someone shifts all the way to their heel, now you just can't use the ground very well. Like there's no muscles in your heel. It's a static bone.
Sure.
So if all our weight is in our heel, like for example, if we're just going to do like a sagittal plane squat, that's going to allow your glutes to turn on. But if I need to because your glute works both in the transverse plane, it's a rotational muscle, but it's also a sagittal plane muscle. So, that's the reason why when we squat, we say put your weight in your heels and it turns your glute on because we're shifting that torque towards the hip joint. However, from a rotational standpoint, the torque is not going in a direction that's going to allow us to rotate. And also the just contact with your foot in the ground. So your foot's going to basically is what is able to use that ground to rotate. So if we don't have any torque going through our midfoot, which is the rotational bones of our foot, you're not going to be able to create rotation because again, your ankle joint, your knee joint not rotational muscles, your foot and your hip, that's where your rotation comes from. So if you
Yeah,
can't
how
use your foot to,
everything. Yeah.
rotate out of the ground, you're not gonna be able to use your hip to rotate out of the ground either. So the biggest checkpoint for me is that initial knee lift position. Where is their center of gravity? Is it over the middle of the foot? Are they way out over their toe? Are they on their heel? And is their torso shifting as they're lifting their knee? And is the back knee shifting? So if they can't control that initial movement, it's going to be hard for them to create rotation on the ground.
Yeah. Oh, that makes total sense because it's kind of the setup of the domino effect, right? Like if
Yeah.
that isn't set properly, then everything else is just going to be a compensation to make up for that.
Yep. 1000%.
Makes total sense. For, I guess, one thing that you mentioned being on the toe or being on the heel. Some
Mhm.
things that I've also seen in a lot of guys is like really early ankle eversion. I'm not sure if that's, yeah. So like for
Yeah.
those of y'all listening, the inside part of the foot, so the Nike check marks on the outside, but on the inside, it just dumps. Like they lift up and it just kind of already starts to cave. But they're not a anteverted hip or more internal rotated dominant athlete. At that point, you know, my direct thought is like, okay, hey, we need to strengthen the arch of the foot or things like that. But what would your thoughts be if someone just initially just dumps right out of that?
So my initial thought as with everything is why? So are they dumping because there's weakness in the foot or ankle?
Mhm.
Or are they dumping because they've created a really lateral line of push, which is going to just bring that whole foot in? Um,
So it'd be
so
like a over drifting almost, or
yep,
like they're
yep.
just moving
Like
too
you
fast. Okay.
just drifted forward and basically pushed, extended out of that back leg, but you never rotated. Because
Hmm.
if you don't ever rotate, your foot's never going to turn. And then you'll just evert and then basically extend.
Basically
That
like
makes
a lateral lunge
Yep,
without
exactly.
rotation. Yeah.
So a lot of times, I gosh, and it really blows my mind in my industry. So, about I would say about 95% of my caseload are professional athletes. And people love to say, well, this is weak and that is weak, and you need to strengthen this. And realistically, across sports, the vast majority of my professional athletes, like they aren't weak. They
Hmm.
either most likely aren't in a position to use that musculature well, or they haven't from a motor control standpoint, haven't been trained to move in a certain way. But most of these athletes, like they aren't weak. Um, and so that's always just like a little annoyance to me where I'm like, is your, you know, is my professional 250-pound DN really weak? Or is it just not in a position to use this well? Is a pitcher who pitches in the major leagues, like, are his ankles really weak? Or is he just putting himself from a torque standpoint in a position where he's not going to use his inverters and he's not going to use the arch of his foot and he's not going to actually use his midfoot? Um,
It's
you know,
the optimal link tension relationships that you're looking for.
yeah,
That probably makes them strong, but if they're not in that range, that's what's, I guess, labeled as weak. If
yeah,
that, yeah,
yeah.
track
Or,
what you're doing.
an injury that I think we're seeing more and more in professional baseball. Everyone's so worried about elbows. Obviously, it's an epidemic, but I see a lot of oblique injuries. And
Yeah,
it goes
I
to
think
say,
there was a
it's like
database that I
pitchers.
looked at, and I think that was the most injured thing out of, well, again, more than just pitchers, like all position players was oblique injuries, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, they're huge. And you have to go through and say, do we actually think like there's just an epidemic of weak core in the MLB? And my guess is probably not. But are we putting them in positions where we're going to have soft tissue failure because there's such
Mm.
a massive stretch across their core and they don't know how to decelerate? So if you don't know how to decelerate, you're not going to transfer energy well, you're going to get overstretched. Maybe we're putting them in positions where they're way too much hip to shoulder separation, or they've got a ton of torso lateral tilt to try and, like there's certain things that we're putting them in a position where their muscles are going to fail over and over and over again. Or do we just think we just need to strengthen their core all year long? Or should we
Yeah.
look at what positions we're in, how they're transferring momentum, how they're throwing, how they're moving? My bias is obviously like we need to look at how they're moving and change how they're moving versus like, okay, we're just going to strengthen your core.
Yeah, it's a little too, again, kind of going back to this isolated versus holistic view is they're just trying to isolate it down to one variable when it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, wow. This could go in a bunch of different directions. But from where I'm getting from that too is, you have guys who, they're labeled as like they have weak cores or things like that, but they have really good range of motion for like maybe extension. And, they get labeled as like, oh, hey, they're just like super hypermobile or whatnot. Maybe at that point, would you just be like, hey, like, you probably need to strengthen this a little bit, but at the same time, it's more of how they're moving in and out of those positions versus just the static range that they have.
Yeah, I think of both and too, right? Like if you have somebody
Mhm.
that's really loosey-goosey mover, they're gonna have to move in a way that pulls out slack
Sure.
to tension the system. Because that's how you're gonna transfer energy most efficiently. So then you have to look at, maybe not just outright, one rep max type 1 rep max type strength, but you have to look at end range strength. So, can we stabilize you? Can we train in a way that stabilizes you at end range and teaches you to activate at end range? Because for your body type, you're going to have to get to end range because you have so much slack in the system. So I'm going to train you in these end ranges, whether that's isometrics, whether that's eccentrics, and get you to learn how to really turn these muscles on in these extreme ranges of motion, because maybe it's more just an activation timing issue for you versus like a let's just test your 1 rep max and just get you to hold a plank as long as possible, and how many hanging leg raises can you do, but more so like can we get you to activate and stabilize in a
Mhm.
really extreme range of motion.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of people too that are really good at the absolute strength, and then they spend very little time on the opposite side of the strength velocity curve, right? It's
Yeah.
honestly kind of blows me away where, I'm literally looking at this guy's numbers, like he deadlifts five or like almost 600 pounds, checks all of those boxes for just overall general strength. And I'm like, are you spending more time trying to get that better when it's already, I've kind of piggybacked off of Scott Emerson where he says useful velocity. I'm like, we need useful strength too.
Yeah.
Like it needs to be something that you can use more than just with a barbell or with a dumbbell. Like, can you actually do it through a dynamic movement with a med ball or, something that is a lot more ballistic, that's a little bit closer down that velocity curve, closer to a pitch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And that's not to say there isn't, time and place for just traditional strength training. Obviously, there
oh,
is.
sure.
I think absolutely what you said. Like, we need to be training velocity, we need to be training movement, we need to be training, speed of contraction, time under tension, all these things. One of my favorite questions to a professional athlete is, what do you love in the weight room and what do you hate in the weight room? And I think it
Hmm.
tells you so much, because what they generally hate in the weight room is what they need to work on.
Yeah,
There's a reason
that's
they
very
hate it.
true.
It's because their body doesn't want to be in that position, or they don't feel comfortable in that position, or it hurts for some reason. And so that automatically tells me, okay, there's some sort of dysfunction there, you know?
Yeah, no, it's kind of an intuitive almost thought process for them is like, hey, they gravitate towards what they're good at.
Yep.
I mean, I do that selfishly even in my own personal training, right? Like it's like, hey, I still like
Yep.
some of the heavy lifts and I'm not a huge fan of doing anything with the hamstrings. So in general, my posterior chain sucks.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, you find out the same thing with an athlete, maybe they love, squatting and benching, but they hate anything with a med ball. Okay, why?
Hmm.
you know, or whatever it is, or they hate plyos. Okay, why? Okay, your ankle range of motion is actually terrible. So you hate plyos because it always hurts your Achilles tendon. And, we just tease these things out like,
Yeah.
okay, again, I think these things are easier ways to assess an athlete. Okay, you hate back squatting. My initial reaction is either you have chronic back injuries and so you hate putting weight in your back, or there's something in your lower extremity range of motion wise that makes it really hard to get into a squat position with weight on your back. So that gives me a better idea that there might be a range of motion issue than me putting you on a table and testing your, let's, for example, ankle dorsiflexion range of motion.
It's
So it's
it's
questions like
definitely a
that.
more practical
Yeah.
assessment, I think.
Yeah. 1000%.
Love it. Well, one thing you mentioned too, I think you were going down the topic of hip shoulder separation.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard this presentation from Franz Bosch, and it kind of stuck with me ever since as far as hip shoulder separation.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to give him credit. This is not my idea, but he was talking about how there's like a shear force, almost like forced hip shoulder separation. right? So think of it for you guys who are listening, your pelvis is going one way and you're forcing your shoulders to go another way.
Yeah.
And that's, again, this is just me speaking out loud. It's one reason why I don't like to use pivot picks, because it's a lot of that shear forced rotation versus a true hip shoulder rotation. Hip shoulder separation and rotation is coming from the pelvis, and then everything just, again, kind of domino effects
Yeah.
from have you been able to kind of identify that in any biomechanics lab, or maybe just generally assessing guys, or is that something that you just kind of have to and ask an athlete is like, hey, are you forcing this backwards?
Yeah. Are you pulling back with your shoulders? Sometimes you can see it in videos. Guys are trying to counter rotate.
Hmm.
Um, and then a lot of times when they do that, they end up in a position of they either land way too close with their pelvis because they can't actually separate that much. They end up pulling themselves back, or just they're trying to create so much hip to shoulder separation that they land way too open. So I see
Hmm.
like guys who do that end up on one side of the spectrum or other, usually way too close or way too open. I think what we forget with hip to shoulder separation is there's a really powerful moment where the hips and shoulders are now rotating open together. That's when both our feet are on the ground and we're still creating torque at the pelvis. For a brief moment of time, your pelvis and torso are rotating together. And then
Hmm.
from a training standpoint, we never teach guys to rotate their pelvis and torso together because we're so focused on separation. But there's a really important point of time in which those two segments are still rotating together. And then the pelvis should, stop and obviously allow the torso to continue to accelerate. But yeah, so that's usually if I see in the video or even in the data that somebody's counter rotating when they're initiating that drive down the mound, I'm usually seeing a whole host of other issues with where and how they land with that front foot. Because it's also going to alter your center of gravity. So if you think about it, at that point in time, you still only have one leg on the ground and your torso carries a ton of your mass. Your other leg is going to start to move outside of your base of support. Now, if your torso is also moving outside of your base of support, you're going to lose balance. You're going to lose connectivity with the ground. There's a whole host of issues that can happen there. Yeah, I can
Oh,
definitely be.
absolutely. I agree with that. And I didn't think of it as far as like changing your center of gravity when you do that, but the obvious, whenever guys like tilt their shoulders back, right? Like that's an obvious, like, yeah, your center of mass has definitely changed, right? But if you're over rotating now, yeah, everything, it does shift. It changes a little bit of everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. What we have seen really preliminarily is when we put EMG on guys, just surface level EMG, and look at activity, we get what would appear to be more of like an isometric counter rotation. So they're not actively counter rotating, but they're holding tension in their torso essentially so that their torso stabilizes while their pelvis moves. And those tend to be the people that move and rotate really well. And it's not that
Hmm.
they're actively pulling back with their shoulders, but they're holding tension in their obliques, in their lats, and in these counter rotators that are going to hold posture while their pelvis opens.
So they're
So
resisting that. Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
How
So it
would
almost ends up being
you,
more of an isometric.
yeah. And I guess that's why, to certain degrees, why certain mid ball throws work is because they kind of have to do that in order to throw the ball into the wall straight.
Yep.
If again done properly, or like a shot put, for example, like they have to resist that rotation as they're moving forward and the pelvis starts to rotate.
Yep. Under load.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. Had a little epiphany there myself. Cool. I
Oh,
like that.
amazing. Love to hear it.
Yeah. It's awesome. Well, I mean, with that, like, you know, and I love having conversations like this because I think it helps not only us as each other grow selfishly. It's why I do the podcast, but everyone who listens to this, they're like, oh, okay, I didn't think of it that way. Right. And it just kind of helps everyone progress and move forward with their thought process and not get stuck on stupid, so to speak. Right.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
What is, I know we talked a little bit about, you were saying that you wish the industry or physical therapy or, biomechanics industry, can get stuck on certain things like the numbers or interpretation or assessments. What is something that you think, I guess you kind of answered this question, but for the baseball professional side, what do you think we get stuck on other than, you already alluded to like the still frame photos or trying to get into positions. Do you see anything maybe that's currently trending now that people are just a little too gravitated towards, or maybe a little too gung ho on, that may not make much of a difference?
Yep. Um, I think the big two that come to mind is just in general, like a lot of these we kind of talked about in the beginning, there's a difference between input and output variables. I think
Mm,
a lot of the baseball industry gets stuck on these output variables. Two that come to mind would be, throwing arm extension towards the plate and then lead leg blocking. And they see guys that have issues with these two things and they try and drill out those two things when really like those are all just consequences of what you did before. And
yeah.
so if the overall, if the performance industry can get behind like figuring out from a physics perspective, from a movement perspective, like what are they doing that's causing that movement, and being able to affect more of those causes instead of being so focused on the consequences, I think a lot of guys would get better a lot faster.
Yeah. That kind of sums up a lot of things, to be honest. Yeah, you got to look at more of the root cause
Yep.
versus the cough and runny nose symptom, if that makes.
Yep.
Yeah,
1,000%. Mm-hmm.
totally
So
get
I
that.
think, yeah, performance people are good at recognizing, hey, this is an issue. You're not blocking well, you're not capturing energy at the arm well, you're not getting a lot of extension. They're good at recognizing those things, but then I think the focus becomes on trying to affect those things, and then instead
Mm,
of figuring out what is affecting those things.
yeah, and that can get lost a little bit too, maybe from the professional to the athlete interpretation, right? Like even if it's me or you or whoever says, "Hey, that Jimmy, you are getting worse at this, or this is decreasing." Their
Yeah,
first initial thought would probably be also like, "Oh, I'm missing extension. Okay, I gotta like really intentionally reach out."
really reach out there. Yeah,
Mhm. Versus if we educate them, we're like, "Hey, this is why you're missing some of that extension. Your
yeah,
back hip's not rotating properly or something else." Then that completely changed their thought process. It's like, okay, so now my game plan is to really hammer this back leg, make sure it's rotating well so that I can get to that extension piece.
yeah, 1,000%. What's the back leg doing? Is the torso stopping? Can you
Mm,
actually decelerate your torso? If you don't, if your torso keeps moving, your arm's going to slow down. You're probably not going to get as much extension by the time you release the ball. If your torso stops really quick, it's going to fling that arm around that arc of that circle. Your arm's going to be moving faster in a horizontal adduction range of
mhm.
motion. You're going to get more extension. So, I mean, there's little things that you can look at that are telling more of the story than the actual KPI that you're measuring or looking at or assessing.
Absolutely. Well, and one thing that you did mention, I kind of want to touch on this a little bit too, because it is kind of also about the pelvis and how it stops is, you know, you mentioned the front leg, lead leg block or whatever, which is kind of a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah.
People trying to just go into that knee extension
Yep.
when it's a result of how the pelvis moves. But
Yeah.
if a guy's landing with his front leg, and let's say he's a right-handed pitcher, and it shifts laterally, or more towards the first base side,
His
is
pelvis
that
does.
what's that?
So you're saying the pelvis shifts more towards first base?
Yeah, so let me help kind of describe this. So he lifts up, you go through the whole thing, he lands, and again, we don't want to, like you talked about before, probably need to go back to the beginning of how he was moving before to get there.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say he's getting there, his pelvis just kind of continues to rotate. So if his pelvis is here, continues to rotate, doesn't really stop, and his knee is and pelvis are kind of gliding over towards first base.
Mm.
Is that a stability issue of them like not being able to get to that stop position, or is that a hip internal rotation range of motion issue? I'm sure there's probably multiple answers to this, but in
Yeah.
general, what would you go for that?
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head is, there's multiple options that you got kind of have to start teasing out what the issue is. So the
Hmm.
first thing you would look at is, did they rotate out of the back leg? If they're not rotating to begin with, they won't rotate at the end. And so if their pelvis is sliding a lot instead of rotating over that femur, a lot of times that's the reason. The other thing that can happen is they can run out of hip internal rotation range of motion at that front hip. So if they run out of hip range of motion, that pelvis and that momentum has to go somewhere. It's going to end up popping up and over the femur, or it can laterally glide as well. to avoid that range of motion. And the other potential option is strength. They don't have the eccentric strength or activation in their hamstrings and glutes to actually like eccentrically stop that and control that pelvis rotation. And so those are kind of your three. We always say that movement deficits kind of fall into three buckets. It's either, a motor control issue. So just the way that they're moving issue. So, do they rotate out of the back hip would be, the one that falls into that category. Strength issue or range of motion issue. It's one of those three. So they either don't have the capacity, strength or range of motion to move differently, or they don't know how to move differently, or they've been trained to move a certain way. So if they have the strength and range of motion, teach them to rotate out of the back hip, it should solve it.
Sure. Yeah. I love that. That's a great way to kind of boil it all down. It's like, hey, yeah, you have the capacity or the control to be able
Yeah,
to do a certain movement. That's
for
really
sure.
cool.
Make it
Love
simple.
it.
Keep it simple.
That's it. You got to. You can't overcomplicate things because then it gets over people's heads and then, they demonize as like, oh, biomechanics is terrible. Or, insert
Yeah,
whatever.
or
To
it's
put in there.
useless, or
The
it's
data
not.
is terrible. Yeah.
Yeah. It might be used in a way currently that's useless, but it has the potential to be so useful if we could integrate it better, if we could speak a common language between pitching performance and sports science, and if we could actually learn to look at the variables that matter and tell a story versus these outputs.
Absolutely. I think the whole language piece is huge, having kind of consistent language and why I think, when you're going through school and you're learning all these scientific terms, it's how everybody kind of speaks that language in a way so that they know they're talking about the same thing,
Yeah.
right? Versus in the baseball industry, it's like you have one drill and it's called five different things. One, because people just want to be different or market it differently, which I get, but at the same time, it's like, hey, how do we have that continuity, or even in the pro side, you have one coach at low A that calls it one thing, and then the big league guy calls it something completely different. And I think
Yeah.
they'll touch on in the presentations at the bridge too. But you got to have a common language for sure, so that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. Well, Emily, do you have anything else you'd like to kind of leave some of the listeners, or where they can reach out to you and talk to you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Ferree_pt_lab, or on Twitter at Ferree.pt. So yeah, reach out to me. I'm down in Southern California, so if any pictures are there, want some assessments. We're rocking and rolling down here, so let me know.
That's it. Go and see her. Get everything truly assessed and making sure that it's more practical to what you need.
Yeah, I'll just put you on the table and measure your range of motion. It'll be great.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Awesome. Well, for those of you listening, appreciate you tuning in and stay in the zone.